It's the last day of Gen Con, and it was the Highhelm and Sky King's Tomb Designers Commentary. And these are great panels that allow you to see maybe why choices were made, why things are happening, even get some spoilers into some of the future Sky King's Tomb adventures, as well as seeing a lot of the great concept art that Kent Hamilton put out. And we got to see a lot of that today. But with all that being said, my name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. So this panel today, we had Luis Loza and John Compton kind of both presented jointly this particular designer's commentary, and it was a really great thing. But I'm going to go ahead and be looking at my notes over here, and we can discuss. I'll be showing pictures as we go throughout, and towards the end, we're going to see the concept art for all 12 of the clans. There's a lot of it. So I want to kind of show those. So I'll be showing those maybe even a little bit before I start getting to that particular section. But all that aside, let's go ahead and get into this commentary. So basically they wanted to go beyond the pages and delve deep in quotes, delve deep into Highhelm and Sky King's Tomb. And they talked a little bit about what were the Pathfinder doors before this. And there are a lot of Dwarven tropes. They're familiar, but there were some Pathfinder unique things beyond the classical tropes, and they kind of go into the history of the quest for Sky. Dwarves originally lived underground only until one day their god Torag said, "Keep an eye out for a sign, and once you see the sign, go and find the sky." Whatever that is, whatever the sign would be. So an enormous earthquake came, and they took it as the sign. They traveled upward, and after a very long time, they found the sky and the surface. This history is so baked into Dwarven tradition and culture, but the original homes were called the Sky Citadels. So they aren't necessarily citadels in the sky, they are just places where dwarves could see the sky. And there are 10 of them, and Highhelm is one of those. So dwarves are very familiar, but they wanted to give them a unique identity and make an effort to branch out from the stereotype. So dwarves are traditionalists, but their culture is built around clans and clan daggers, and everything is built around the clan. So more about the clan dagger is the clan dagger is given to a dwarf when they are born. They're specifically crafted just for them. They are used to cut your umbilical cord, and at that point it tastes its first blood. You keep it, and it is an important part of your life, an important part of a ritual at your birth. You are expected to hold on to it for the rest of your life. And each clan might have a different use for their dagger, and the type of clan dagger can have unique functions based on their clans. And one of the ones they brought up was you have a clan that brews ale, and they might have special gems in them that match a certain color for the type of brew or ale that you are making. If it disappears, that means that it is brewed correctly. So Pathfinder's ancestries have weapons that might have specific ancestry traits. Some had them from existing lore, but even if they don't, they want each one of these ancestries to kind of have at least two of them. So clan daggers came out of that. You can see the clan's personality from their clan dagger. Every clan has their own specific uses. Stats wise, it might just be a basic dagger, but it does have some special traits. And another example from a clan is it might be a trowel for digging in the dirt. So it is also possible by switching clans that maybe your clan dagger doesn't necessarily match what clan you might currently be in, because you can switch. But it's stuff that you can build upon, stuff that you can build a story around, and the dagger is made to be used. It is not ornamental. Then we went into a little bit about what is going on in Highhelm. Highhelm is big, and a lot of things are going on. There are 10 Sky Citadels in the book, but Highhelm is the biggest, and the potential for the stories from Highhelm is immense because of this. The city is interesting in that it is built into Emperor's Peak, which is the mountain. The city has a big spiral ramp that you can make your way up and down the levels. It's wide enough for carts and for moving things around the city. Other ancestries do live there, not just dwarves. They brought up the fact that even fire elementals live here, and it has very interesting fantasy potential. It is visually an interesting city, and it's fun to see how dwarves live compared to humans. And some questions come up like, how do they breathe underground? Where do they get their water? Well, there's things that they learn by doing dungeon design that kind of answer those questions on how do things live there and how do they continue their life and how do they continue doing normal things? So there are some things that allow Highhelm to sustain itself. Some of it is magic or technology, but it is not just hand waved along as, oh, it's magic, everybody can live here. For example, the water comes from a connection to the plane of water. And one of the questions that comes up is, if you swim through a reservoir, could you eventually wind up in the plane of water? Or could the plane of water flood the entire mountain? So these are things, little hooks that are part of the story. Another important thing to remember is there is Dwarven cunning, and they are engineers. And they had this thing figured out for millennia before the quest for Sky because they lived underground. An example for the air thing is, although they are magical, there's a special type of moss called a breather moss that creates air for people. So there are these special plants, but it's not really just hand waved. There are reasons for things to happen. Another thing they brought up, and I liked from some of the initial things that we saw, as well as from reading Highhelm myself, is grindle grubs. Grindle grubs feed on excess waste, and if things go wrong, you can eat them and you can farm them as well as any other livestock. Now, there are a lot of different ancestries that live there. Basically, they wanted to combat one of the tired stereotypes that it's only doors and the doors will seal them off for millennia and not interact with any other cultures. In Pathfinder, they wanted to bring other people in so you don't just have to come up with a reason why, oh, there's a human in the middle of this Dwarven city. How did he get there? You don't have to worry about that because the doors are actively trying to bring people in. So Sky King's Tomb was already in the works when John came on, and this was one of his first adventures that he did. And working on the first volume, they wanted to show the rich variety of Highhelm. So there are some zany possibilities in a traditional Dwarven city. There is a plane of fire, has a connection in the Sky King's heart. There are connections to fire elemental touch ancestries, and sometimes that fire elementals will come in. And they brought up an example of some fire touched ferrets that you can use as kind of like a side quest or a side adventure where you can help wrangle these ferrets up and prevent them from lighting everything on fire and the shenanigans that ensue from that. And they talked about some particular sites within Highhelm that can draw some interest, like the Thieves Guild training ground. They wanted to have a location in a generally safe city so that there's some conflict, there's some reason for adventure or adventuring to happen. And this Thieves Guild training ground is it. So it's a nice place, but there is some conflict. In the Black Moon Thieves Guild, they do things like smuggling and cons and extorting individuals in certain places. However, they also have the Black Moon Goblet. And what this is it's kind of like a series of tunnels and abandoned places. And it's like a death trap maze. And they have put a bunch of their coins within this maze. And if you travel to the Black Moon Goblet and get one of these coins and somehow make it out alive, then you can go to the Thieves Guild and say, I would like to join. And that's when they're going to take you seriously. So you need to do some of these minimum things in order to even get into maybe the Thieves Guild. And one of the potential side quests is an NPC has tried to get into the guild and has went to go get a coin but hasn't come back. So the family is worried about that individual and they might hire you to go into the Black Moon Gauntlet in order to try to get this particular individual out. And then another concern for Highhelm is, because it is generally a safe city, is there enough danger? Is there enough conflict for adventurers to want to hang out in? So they seeded in some strife, some conflict, and some story potential. It's not just a monster here or a conflict there. There are conflicting ideologies from the various organizations within Highhelm that can cause some intrigue. Are there people that are spying? Is there subterfuge from within as well as without? Are the clans getting along? These are interesting stories with dwarves as the main characters. Now, classical doors have a very vendetta type thing going on, and doors will take a lot of time to warm up to you, and they also remember things for a very long time. So there are not just fresh points of contention, but there are also these millennia or centuries long things that have happened and that are going on that are part of the story to create this sense of intrigue and adventure. There's also a bit of playful pettiness. So this long scale needs to be understood. Dwarves take their time, and by the, in their time, it's many years. It's not like an afternoon or a week. The time scale is relative to dwarves, not humans. And so you need to scale things to understandable time frames. So an example they brought up is regional leaders might meet together to kind of do a state of the region type meeting, and they'll do that once a millennia. And if something like an emergency is occurring, they might do it every 10 years or every 20 years. So there's a different time scale that needs to be understood. Now, it is not just about Highhelm, but it is also about the Darklands, a 3-level layer below the city. In the first book for Sky King's Tomb, you go a little bit into the Darklands and experience some danger that you did not expect to find. And as you progress in the story, it takes you further and further away from the safe city of Highhelm. The Darklands is a delving adventure, and they are as expansive as you might expect them to be. There is a balance within Highhelm so that normal people can't just go to the Darklands whenever they want to. However, they are guarded, but a clever player characters can go ahead and find their way in. Now, there are some fun little Easter eggs. One of the things was from the Lost Omens travel guide. They name dropped Imperial Conquest as a game and Prismati as a game. And this is like a whole new item that is a specific board game that as you play, you might unlock secret compartments. You can get special things. Another is a new game called Elemental Stones, which actually will be sold to us on Paizo.com. And it's a game that you can actually play. So it's maybe like a dice game or a token game, but it's something that we will be able to play outside of the adventure itself, or maybe you could play it at the table while you're doing the adventure. And some other things that came out from some of the settings book was they always want to look for stories that can be brought out. You know, think of like a Leshy playing basketball. You know, why would that happen? But there is a game called Basilisk, and it is a full contact kind of blindfolded rugby type game. And there is one particular segment where the Felton Flame Pelts from Brassia come in, and one of the star players of the Highhelm Hodags is out of commission, and one of the player characters with acrobatics or athletics could step in, and if you help them win, you know, you might get free alcohol for a week from one of the bars. So then we went to Sky King's Tomb. Sky King's Tomb starts in Highhelm, and that is the headquarters, kind of where you're always going to be going back to. And they brought up some of the things that you can see in the Darklands, how they didn't just want to make, you know, just humanoids, 2 arms, 2 legs, and be boring. They wanted to kind of branch out a little bit. It also has fantasy RPG cities. Each one is a little bit further from safety, and each one is a little bit weirder than the last, but you are going to run into these as you go through the adventures. First one, which is the picture, has strange architecture and inhabitants, and further in there are places of safety, and there are places that you can restock, but there are also going to be places that are not friendly or safe at all. And the later 2 volumes, the locations and the locales that you could get into are just a little bit weirder. And then they brought up a section that was maybe some spoilers. So Sky King's Tomb ends up pulling on some specific material from Lost Omen Legends for part of the plot. So in the quest for Sky, it was a long process and a long migration. Without firm focus, it might have fallen apart, and some parts did splinter off. So Target tried to keep them together as he's leading them to the surface and starts leading them during the construction. But after the construction starts, he starts stepping back and thinks of, well, how did we get here and what do we do now? And dwarves have vendettas, as mentioned, and ancestral enemies. And they looked at how to open the setting to look at what vendettas they have and maybe how you could resolve some of these vendettas. Whose nose did we have to bloody to get here? So Targic disappears towards the end of his life to do some soul searching, as well as the building of his own tomb, because a mausoleum was kind of made for him, but he didn't quite like it, so he wanted to go build his own hidden tomb. And so he went to the Darklands, and you get to find out what actually happened to him. There is a desire from some elements to see you dead, and their desire is due to crimes and baggage that you might be able to help alleviate and resolve. Also in the Legends book, Targic had a last will and testament that got buried by some in the Dwarven community. The start of the Highhelm book has some information about that, and that really inspired Sky King's Tomb, what is known and should be known, and what you are going to do with that information when you find it. So part of the player character's journey towards Sky King Tomb is about, you know, how alignment changed with the remaster, and Torag is lawful good. One of his edicts is to kick down your enemies before they kick you, basically. And it's very pragmatic in how you take down the enemies of your people. The theme for the adventure path is that it does not funnel you into a way of thinking, but you can explore how you would handle the information or the conflict. In Highhelm, it is still a living and breathing setting, and it might even be the deity that is having to reckon with things. So the remaster tweaked Torag's Anathema to more of a strike first when you have no other choice and kind of give the people a chance before you strike. And talked a little bit about the Dwarven Pantheon, of how it's Torag and his family. And without Droskar, they become the Sky Keepers. And if you don't have Droskar or Torag there, it is the Forged Kin Pack. And there are reasons as to why you might or not want to keep Torag around in the Pantheon. So the Dwarven Pantheon is also brought up in a smaller format in the Player's Guide for Sky King's Tomb if you want to play as a follower, so you'll have that basic information. Also brought up that Sky King's Tomb is almost entirely underground. You're adventuring in the dark. So what do you need to keep in mind when you're adventuring in the dark? Some characters have dark vision and some aren't going to. So what do you need to do? And it kind of teaches you how to be as equipped as possible and what's going to be involved in this adventure path. You do not need to play as a dwarf in this adventure path, and there are different hooks within the player's guide as to why other ancestries would even get involved in this whole situation whatsoever. If you're an orc or a half orc, it's totally doable. And they brought up the fact that you can even play a skeleton if you want to. It's a hard one to hook into, but if you did something like maybe you need to right one final wrong that you did to the dwarves, depending on what the ancestry before you were a skeleton could be, maybe that could be a plot hook. But there are doable ways to bring other ancestries and different things into Sky King's Tomb, as well as information on how to join a Dwarven clan when you're not a dwarf. It kind of gives you a jumping off point in Highhelm, if not a concrete set of rules, but at least gives the players and the GM somewhere to go in order to look on how that might be possible. And then there are also interesting character backgrounds that are specific to the Sky King's Tomb and Highhelm setting. So Sky King's Tomb also introduces you to a bunch of organizations and non-player characters. And the thought was to shotgun a bunch of ideas and NPCs at the player characters at the start so they could figure out how they wanted to play their character in this specific setting. So you'll learn a lot about groups and motivations and connections that you can hook your player into. Sky King's Tomb is also about reclaiming the past, and they brought up Dwarven relics. And here's quite a few pictures of some of the Dwarven relics that they brought up. In the Game Mastery Guide, there's a bunch of info about relics, but these are foundational kind of cult type things that can grow with the player character as they go up in level, and it can fit into the treasure per level that your characters would normally get when you're considering that as a GM. These relics have historical themes that dwarves can play with. They are imbued with power, and they bring in quite a few of these relics in the first 2 volumes to tell more of the story that grow with the player. So the growth potential is a little bit looser, so the GM can guide it to not make it too powerful or too weak, as well as giving the players a little bit of agency into how their relics will grow. And they brought up something, not a real relic, but an example they had at the desk was a pen. And maybe if you use this pen enough, you'll become better at resolving conflicts by using the pen to write things to resolve a conflict. And then they brought up what kind of danger was involved in Sky King Tomb. There are new monsters as well as old classics and spins on the old classics. Frengar were dwarves that ignored the call for Sky, so they stayed underground. And these are one of the groups that might be hostile towards you. And there are a lot of groups that are going to be hostile, but you have the opportunity to resolve these conflicts without combat. You can definitely do combat all the way if you want to, but resolution is possible without combat in a lot of cases. And they wanted to add new stuff so you're not just fighting 2-armed, 2-leg humanoids the whole entire time. There are going to be things that could be interesting or gross or fun to play against. And then when we get to the actual layout of the Darklands, there are some passages that are broadened out, as well as some passages that are intentionally narrow and close and cramped. And it allows you to find places to go to, as well as to get away from, and expect to see a bunch of subterranean humanoids, quadrupeds, undead, plus some things that would be better off if you don't fight them at all. And here's where I'm going to start showing some of the concept art for the clans, because this would be the only art for this particular sections, and I would just want to give everybody enough chance to kind of look at them. But John brought up some of the most exciting things in the adventure path or Easter egg he'd like to spoil, and John brought up that there's a minor clan sidebar for a clan called Clan Pearlcast, and they are an aquaculture themed clan. And one of the side quests you can do is there's a giant crab rancher, and his prized crab is in distress. Her name is Lady Shimmerstrap. Also, one of the lesser known things are the River Thune, which is an animism Dwarven tradition that is kind of from Pathfinder RPG adventures, and it makes a return. And there are River Thune character options, and it's kind of something you wouldn't think because it's more occult than what you would expect from doors, as well as some other callbacks from some of the Lost Omen books, such as from the Inner Sea Castles. There is an NPC called Bellum who ran some for-profit prisons that you will meet, and what you do with them is kind of up to you. And then they started talking about Kent Hamilton and how he did the concept art for the various clans, and talked about how some of them, like Clan Runebinder, uses throat singing for their spells. There's no mechanical benefit to that or anything that needs to be done for that, but it is more for flavor, but it just kind of adds. And the concept art shapes the world and the book, and it sells the ideas of the clans to the authors who had to write it. So it's kind of good to have these laid out before you actually start writing a lot of things about it. And they also mentioned that Kent is the artist for the Starfinder mechs, which is interesting. So then they talked about the history chapter. It makes mention of the Dwarven kingdoms before the quest for Sky because there wasn't just one, but they get broken off or wiped out during the quest for Sky. 2 kingdoms split off to the west, 2 kingdoms went south, 1 went to the east, and these would be the ones in the Mwangi Expanse, Arcadia and Tianjia. Some clans fought orcs and 2 were destroyed, and 1 was cut off, and that was the one that is in Casmiran. And how they talked about how it's easier sometimes to travel the world when you don't have to go over land and they could dig. So there are points where they dug under the oceans in order to get where they needed to go. Then they brought up that Highhelm is a living place. They've done millennia of surface habitation, but there is always something new to be added and room to grow. So much so that there are even laws in place as to where you can and cannot tunnel. And there are plot hooks that are put within Highhelm and Sky King's Tomb in order to explain characters coming in, because they are doubling down on interacting with the rest of the world. And then they brought up one last thing, was monsters that are gross. There are monsters that are subterranean. There are monsters that you think are going to be there and some that you might not. But there is a lizard monster, a pangolin, that has a thagomizer. Luis thought it was a fun little thing to include because it's one of those stegosaurus spikes on the end of the tail, but that's an actual name for it, is a thagomizer, and he was able to bring that in. Now, I do hope you like this summary of the Lost Omens, Highhelm, and Sky King's Tomb designer's commentary. I found it really interesting. Both of these are kind of in publication, at least the first book of Sky King's Tomb, but I'm glad to know a little bit more about what's going on in Sky King Tomb, as well as some of the Easter eggs that are laid within Highhelm and how it calls back to some other Lost Omens book. But I do hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.